When the first photos leaked, most people didn't even realize what they were looking at. No ribbon, no president, no crowd, just a sealed room, rows of identical black cabinets, thick cables disappearing into the floor, and armed guards standing where journalists were supposed to be. The government didn't call it an opening, they called it an activation. The announcement itself was barely a paragraph long. 2 government data centers had gone live. That was it. No explanation of what they contained. No list of systems being moved. No reason for the secrecy. Yet inside security circles, this single move triggered more attention than most political speeches in the last year. So what exactly was activated inside those rooms, and why did it need to happen quietly? Let's find out. What was activated inside those rooms wasn't a website, or a new app, or some digital service for citizens. It was something much heavier. It was the state itself, copied into machines. Inside those black cabinets were the systems that decide whether a person exists in the eyes of the government or not. The National Civil Registry, birth and death records, identity databases, passport systems, tax records, customs platforms, government communication networks, internal security monitoring, digital public services. Every process that turns a human being into a legal entity was now sitting inside 2 secured facilities, running on hardware physically located in Burkina Faso. Before this moment, those systems were scattered. Some were on regional platforms. Some were hosted by foreign providers. Some relied on external infrastructure for backup, authentication, or recovery. They functioned, but they were fragmented. The state's memory was spread across borders, split into pieces, and maintained by different hands. The activation meant something very specific. All of that was pulled back. Not symbolically, not rhetorically. Literally transferred, migrated, reconfigured, and sealed inside 2 locations under Burkinabe control. It was like taking the brain of the state, disassembling it from foreign bodies, and reconnecting it to a new nervous system built at home. That's why there was no ceremony. You don't celebrate when you move your heart. You do it quietly, carefully, and with as little attention as possible. Because once those systems go live internally, everything changes. Every request for data now travels a different path. Every login hits a domestic server. Every government email routes through the national infrastructure. Every digital fingerprint of the population is processed inside the country. The state stops borrowing computational space from the outside world. It starts inhabiting itself. And this is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because when people think about power, they imagine leaders, speeches, elections, soldiers, and protests. But none of those actually run anything anymore. They sit on top of systems. The real power lives in the machines that store, verify, classify, and remember who you are, where you live, whether you can travel, whether your money clears, whether your vote is counted, whether you appear in records or disappear from them. All of that is decided by code. And now that code lives inside those rooms, which means if those rooms shut down, the state goes blind. If they are compromised, the state is exposed. If they are controlled, the state is owned. And if they are protected, the state becomes something it has never really been before, digitally self-contained. This is why the word activation matters. You don't activate infrastructure. You activate systems of authority. Burkina Faso didn't just switch on servers. It switched on a version of the state that no longer needs to ask external systems to function. A version that can store its own memory, authenticate its own people, and process its own reality. And that leads to the question that nobody asked publicly, but everyone inside the system understands. If the state now lives inside these 2 rooms, where exactly had it been living before? It had been living everywhere except at home. Not in one place, not in one system, not even under one set of laws. Before the activation, Burkina Faso's digital state existed as a scattered organism. Parts of it sat on regional platforms. Other parts lived inside foreign cloud infrastructure. Some systems depended on international telecom backbones. Others relied on outsourced software vendors who controlled updates, patches, and access layers. There was no single center of gravity, just a network of borrowed spaces. When a citizen registered a birth, that data often traveled through servers outside the country before returning. When a passport was issued, authentication could depend on external platforms. When telecom traffic was analyzed, the routing passed through international hubs. When government systems needed recovery after outages, backups were sometimes hosted abroad. When cybersecurity incidents occurred, monitoring tools belonged to foreign companies. Everything worked, but nothing was truly owned. The state was functioning, yet always as a guest inside other people's infrastructure. And this created a strange psychological illusion. From the inside, it felt sovereign. Ministries made decisions. Laws were passed. Elections were held. But underneath, the digital foundation of all those actions was not anchored locally. It floated. Like a country whose capital city was real, but whose nervous system lived offshore. The most dangerous part was not security. It was dependency without visibility. Most officials didn't even know where certain systems were physically hosted. Contracts changed. Vendors rotated. Platforms merged. Services migrated. Over time, no single authority could point to a complete map of where national data actually resided. The state became something like a distributed ghost, present in documents, present in speeches, present in institutions, but digitally dissolved across multiple jurisdictions. This meant something subtle but powerful. If pressure ever came, it wouldn't arrive through tanks or sanctions first. It would arrive through service disruptions, through delayed updates, through revoked licenses, through compliance requirements, through technical issues that were impossible to challenge politically because they didn't look political. Control could be applied without confrontation. Influence could be exercised without visibility. Power didn't need to knock on the door. It already had access credentials. And the deeper problem was this. Once a country becomes used to functioning inside borrowed systems, it stops designing its own. It adapts policies to platforms instead of building platforms for its policies. It accepts limits without ever seeing them as limits. The state becomes operational, but never autonomous. It runs, but it does not stand. That is where Burkina Faso had been living. Inside a global digital environment that was convenient, efficient, and completely outside its jurisdiction. Not colonized, not invaded, just embedded. So when the government decided to pull everything back, it wasn't changing location, it was changing status. From guest to host, from user to operator, from tenant to owner. And that raises the next far more unsettling question. What actually changes inside a country the moment it stops being a digital guest and starts hosting itself? It didn't feel dramatic at first. No one noticed new apps, no visible upgrade for citizens, no sudden digital revolution. The same websites are loaded, the same offices process documents, the same systems kept running. But underneath, the entire direction of data flow had reversed. Before, every government action traveled outward before coming back. Now, everything looped inward. Requests no longer crossed borders to be validated. Logins no longer depended on external authentication layers. Backups no longer lived in foreign recovery systems. Monitoring no longer passes through third-party dashboards. For the first time, the state's digital reflexes stayed inside its own body. This created a new kind of power, temporal control. The government could now see things in real time instead of through delayed reports. It could detect system behavior directly instead of waiting for external analytics. It could observe patterns without filters. It could test policies digitally without exposing raw data to outside platforms. Not smarter overnight, but finally present in its own operations. And presence changes everything. When data is external, decision-making becomes reactive. You wait for reports. You respond to alerts. You operate inside someone else's architecture. But when data is internal, the state stops reacting and starts anticipating. Trends appear before they become crises. Infrastructure usage reveals real behavior instead of estimates. Demographic shifts become measurable. Economic activity stops being abstract and becomes traceable. Security patterns emerge organically instead of being interpreted through imported frameworks. The state begins to develop something it never truly had before: situational awareness. Not intelligence in the military sense, awareness in the existential sense. The ability to know what is happening inside your own system without needing translation. And this is where the shift becomes irreversible. Because once a state experiences internal awareness, it becomes impossible to go back to blindness. Outsourced systems start feeling like operating in the dark. External dashboards feel slow. Foreign platforms feel constraining. The government stops designing policies around what systems allow and starts redesigning systems around what policies require. The direction of power flips. Instead of asking, what does the platform support? The question becomes, what do we want the platform to do? This is how digital independence actually begins, not through slogans, but through feedback loops. The state sees itself, then it adjusts, then it tests, then it refines, and each cycle strengthens internal capacity. But this new awareness creates a new danger, because seeing your system clearly also means realizing how vulnerable it is, how fragile, how exposed, how dependent everything has become on those two rooms. If the data centers fail, the state stumbles. If they are compromised, the state bleeds. If they are taken, the state loses control of itself. So internal awareness doesn't just create power, it creates a single point of existential risk, which leads to the question that every sovereign system eventually faces. If everything now runs inside these machines, who actually controls them? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. The answer is uncomfortable because it's not political, it's technical. Control doesn't belong to whoever cuts the ribbon, signs the decree, or stands in front of the cameras. Control belongs to whoever holds the deepest layer of access, not the building, not the servers, not even the data. The keys, the encryption keys that unlock databases, the root credentials override systems, the security certificates that authenticate identities, the recovery protocols that decide what happens after failure, the update mechanisms that silently reshape how everything works. These layers don't show up in speeches. They exist in configuration files, access logs, and permission hierarchies. And whoever controls them controls reality. In foreign-hosted systems, those layers are split, shared between vendors, cloud providers, cybersecurity firms, and international partners. Access is contractual, distributed, and often invisible to the state itself. The government operates inside a system it never fully owns. But inside Burkina Faso's new data centers, those layers collapse inward. Every root credential is issued under Burkinabe authority. Every security certificate is governed by Burkinabe law. Every system override requires Burkinabe approval. Every recovery operation happens inside national jurisdiction. There is no external legal fallback. No foreign court can quietly demand access. No platform policy can suspend services. No vendor switch that can disable functionality remotely. The state becomes the final gatekeeper, which sounds empowering until you realize what that actually means. It means the entire future of the country's digital existence depends on a handful of access layers managed by a small group of technicians, not ministers, not generals, engineers, system administrators, cybersecurity architects, people whose names will never appear in the news, but whose decisions will determine whether the state lives or collapses. These people now sit at the deepest point of power in the country. They don't command armies, they don't pass laws, they don't give speeches, but they can. Lock systems, restore identities, wipe databases, block access, reroute networks, and resurrect the state after digital death. This is why modern power doesn't fear protests. It fears root access leaks. Once everything runs on internal systems, sovereignty no longer depends on territory. It depends on the access discipline, on credential security, on update governance, on whether internal controls remain internal. And this is the paradox of digital independence. The more power you bring home, the more fragile you become. Because there is no one else to blame, no external platform to hide behind, no outsourced provider to absorb failure. If the system breaks, the state breaks, which is why most governments secretly prefer external hosting. It dilutes responsibility. It spreads risk, It creates buffers between politics and technology. By bringing everything inside, Burkina Faso removed those buffers. Now power is concentrated, visible, and accountable. And that raises the next question that most leaders are afraid to face. If internal control is so risky, why was external control so comfortable in the first place? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Because external control never felt like control, it felt like help. When systems were hosted abroad, everything came with a safety net. If something crashed, a foreign provider fixed it. If there was a breach, an international firm investigated it. If performance dropped, a vendor optimized it. Problems were framed as technical, not political. Failures were framed as glitches, not weaknesses. Responsibility was always shared, diluted, and easy to shift. This created a strange form of comfort. The state could function without fully understanding how its own systems worked. Ministers didn't need to know where servers were located. Agencies didn't need to design architecture. Decisions were made inside platforms that already existed. The government simply adapted its behavior to whatever the system allowed. Over time, this convenience became dependency. Budgets were written around external software. Policies were shaped by platform limitations. Security strategies relied on outsourced monitoring. Even long-term planning assumed that core infrastructure would always belong to someone else. And because everything worked, no one felt the loss. External systems provided something more subtle than efficiency: emotional insulation. Leaders were protected from the consequences of technical failure. If something went wrong, it wasn't a national crisis. It was a contractual issue, a service-level dispute, a vendor problem. Digital responsibility never fully landed on the state. Which is why influence became so easy. When data is hosted externally, pressure doesn't look like pressure. It looks like standards, like compliance, like policy updates, like technical requirements, like integration rules, like security protocols that quietly shape what a government can and cannot do. No one has to threaten. The system already enforces limits. External hosting allows power to operate without confrontation, without visibility, without accountability. Influence becomes invisible because it travels through architecture instead of politics. And the most powerful part is that no one feels oppressed. The state believes it is modernizing. The public believes services are improving. Donors believe development is happening. Everyone feels progress. But the price is structural. Once a country becomes used to external systems, it stops imagining internal ones. It loses the ability to design its own digital future. It becomes a consumer of platforms instead of a creator of infrastructure. Its imagination shrinks to what is available, not what is possible. The country doesn't collapse. It simply stops evolving independently. That is why external control was comfortable. It removed risk. It removed responsibility. It removed the burden of self-design. And that is exactly why internal control is terrifying. Because now, there is no buffer, no platform to hide behind, no vendor to absorb failure, no foreign system to quietly carry the weight of national complexity. Now the state must understand itself or fail by itself. Which brings us to the final question. If internal control removes all safety nets, why would any government choose to live without them? Because at some point, safety stops being protection and starts being a cage. External systems don't just absorb risk, they also absorb growth. They define what is possible before a country even imagines alternatives. Every new idea has to pass through someone else's architecture. Every innovation has to fit inside foreign platforms. Every reform has to respect external constraints that were never debated publicly because they don't look political. Living without the net means something brutally simple. The country is now forced to confront itself. It's a real technical capacity. It's real institutional discipline. It's a real security culture. It's real ability to manage complexity. There is no more pretending. If systems fail, they fail visibly. If data leaks, it leaks nationally. If services collapse, there is no foreign provider to blame. If cybersecurity breaks, the responsibility is internal. This sounds dangerous. And it is. but it's also the only way a state ever becomes real. Because borrowed systems create borrowed confidence. You appear modern without actually mastering anything. You appear sovereign without controlling your own tools. You appear digital while still depending on others to function. Internal systems remove that illusion. Now Burkina Faso has to train its own engineers, build its own security protocols, design its own recovery strategies, create its own standards, maintain its own infrastructure, improve it, break it, fix it, repeat. This is not efficient. It is learning through exposure. And exposure is how power actually forms. Every serious technological society has gone through this phase. Failure without excuses, mistakes without buffers, learning without outsourcing. It's the phase where institutions either mature or collapse. Burkina Faso is choosing to enter that phase voluntarily. Not because it is confident, but because it understands something deeper. A state that cannot host itself cannot survive the next era. The future is not about controlling land. It's about controlling data flows, not about borders, about networks, not about flags, about infrastructure. AI, digital currencies, surveillance systems, smart governance, automated economies, predictive security, none of these work without sovereign data environments. You cannot build them on borrowed machines and expect real autonomy. So the data centers are not the goal. They are the entry point. The moment the country stops being managed quietly and starts managing itself openly. This doesn't make Burkina Faso powerful today. It makes Burkina Faso unavoidable tomorrow. Because once a state hosts its own memory, its own identity, its own communications, its own digital reflexes, external power can no longer operate silently. Influence has to become political again, negotiated again, visible again. And that is the real shift. Not that Burkina Faso gained something new, but that it removed something old, the invisible layer where control used to live. So the final question isn't whether Burkina Faso's experiment succeeds. The real question is, how many African states are still comfortable being protected by systems that were never truly theirs? Let us know in the comments section, should more nations follow up? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about, the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.